of physical knowledge in addressing global issues. Philosophy itself is recognised as a form of wisdom, and it teaches us to reflect on itself, to continually question well-established truths, to verify hypotheses, and to find conclusions. I think that's probably all I want to say. Catherine is going to talk first, and then Tim is going to talk. The subject for this World Philosophy Day, and UNESCO chooses the topics, and the one that they chose was the ancient philosophers. And previous years, we've had topics such as Aristotle's The Good Life, and another topic recently was knowledge, forgiveness, and happiness. Dr. Caroline West, wave at us, Caroline, is a guest speaker, and she's a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy from Sydney University. Her interests include ethics, political philosophy, and philosophy of happiness. The topic for this evening is the quote from Aristotle: "Happiness lies in virtuous activity, and perfect happiness lies in the best activity, which is contemplative." So, Caroline, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have some slides which I'll share with you in a moment. But I think it's very appropriate, actually, that we're celebrating World Philosophy Day by talking about a very famous quote of Aristotle's. And in fact, the activity that we're engaged in tonight is precisely the sort of activity that Aristotle thought took to be constitutive of happiness. So let me share my slides. How's that?
Yes, that's fine, Caroline.
Great. So the quote, really what I wanted to do was unpack this quote, which encapsulates Aristotle's idea of the nature of happiness, which is an incredibly influential idea in philosophy, but perhaps resonates as well with you, you know, in the kind of popular consciousness as well. We'll see about that. And I guess I want to ask, I sort of have two main aims. One is to get us to see how different Aristotle's way of thinking about happiness was from popular ways of thinking about happiness today. And second of all, to ask whether we'd be better off adopting Aristotle's conception of happiness. I won't get very far down the second track, but hopefully it raises some interesting things to think about. So for most moderns, and I think most of us count as moderns, the word happiness in English and its cognates in other languages tend to conjure up the idea of a particular sort of internal subjective psychological state. So when you ask, is someone happy, or when you judge that a particular person is happy, normally what you're doing, or what most people are doing, is simply trying to describe something about their state of mind, something about their mental state. So this is the sense of happiness, by the way, that, you know, I'm sure lots of you, if you read the newspapers, you can't avoid news of the latest happiness research findings, you know, like watching endless reruns of Netflix shows, unsurprisingly, doesn't make many people happy, even though it might bring fleeting pleasure. Having kids has a massively detrimental impact on happiness. We can talk more about the data there. More money doesn't buy as much happiness as you might think. So lots of these findings that get reported, quite, you know, exercise increases happiness. Lots of these findings we read about And almost always what's being measured is a certain sort of psychological happiness. So psychologists call this sort of subjective well-being, and it's kind of got three components, all of them internal psychological states. So positive affect, you know, the presence of positive, so-called positive experiences like joy, contentment, engagement, or affection. The absence of negative experiences like stress, fear, anger, and sadness, and a kind of more, so positive and negative affect have to do with feelings. But there's also a more intellectual thing, which many of us associate with happiness, which has to do with, do you evaluate your life positively from an intellectual point of view? Do you intellectually endorse it as going well? Are you achieving the things that really matter to you, or at least do you think you're achieving them? So this kind of idea of happiness says, you know, if you put it all together, a happy person is someone who's generally cheerful, only occasionally sad or stressed, and on the whole evaluates their life positively. So the important thing to note about this conception is that it's a purely internal psychological state conception. And importantly, it's not evaluative in any way. You know, if you say that someone's happy, whether or not that's true depends completely on, you know, the extent to which they're experiencing joy and engagement rather than sadness or anger or frustration. So you're just describing something about their state of mind. And this is a really important point of contrast between the way many of us nowadays think about happiness as just an internal subjective psychological state and the way Aristotle thought about happiness. The Aristotelian way of thinking about happiness actually harks back to an earlier, much earlier usage of happiness. So the first written occurrences of happiness in the English language are around 1380 in Chaucer's House of Fame. And their happiness didn't refer to a feeling at all. It referred, you know, it meant getting lucky. And that depended on how things were actually turning out for you, you know, how your life was really going, not simply on your state of mind. You know, any feelings of joy that you might experience were sort of consequences of happiness, consequences of the fact that your life was going well. So in the earliest kind of sense of happiness, where hap, you know, from the Middle English meaning kind of chance or fortune, you know, hapless, unlucky, happenstance, you know, you can think of lots of haps in the English language. They all mean sort of chance. So good fortune or chance was the kind of etymology of the term. And so the happiness in its original sense meant that things were going well for you. So if you win the lottery, the happiness of the person who wins the lottery consists in their good fortune and not in the feelings of gladness that they might experience as a result, which are consequences of their happiness. So there's this older sense of happiness, and this is also kind of reflected in the etymology of course, Aristotle didn't use the word happiness because that's an English word. He used the Greek word eudaimonia. And there is some dispute, I should say, about whether, as we'll see, I'll bring this out as we go along, about whether that is actually sort of accurately or correctly translated into English as happiness, because happiness for Aristotle was definitely not a psychological thing. And Aristotle said some things about eudaimonia, which sound very strange translated as claims about happiness. We'll come to those later on. So for Aristotle, very clearly, happiness or eudaimonia, to use the ancient Greek term, was not a kind of purely psychological state at all. In fact, it was an evaluative term, meaning roughly leading a good life. So in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's famous work on ethics, very broadly understood, not just concerned with morality, but concerned, sorry, you can hear my poodle in the background, not just concerned with ethics or morality, but concerned very, very broadly with the question of how we should live. What's the good life for human beings? Aristotle there says, we've practically defined eudaimonia as a sort of living and faring well. So for Aristotle, happiness or eudaimonia it just is synonymous with or equivalent to leading a good life. And then the important question for Aristotle is, well, what does that exactly involve? You know, he wanted to come up with a really substantive account of what eudaimonia consists in. What's the good for human beings, the good life? And as we'll see, Aristotle's answer is that the good life, you know, is a life that satisfies a certain kind of objective standard of value. So to call someone happy in the Aristotelian sense isn't to describe, it's not a purely descriptive term that just says something about their state of mind. It's an evaluative term. What you're saying is they're faring well, they're living well, they're living a good life for a human being. And Aristotle thinks there's much more to happiness or eudaimonia or living a good life for a human being than simply a person's internal state of mind. So let's think of, let's sort of try and bring out a bit more what this means. So notice that, you know, imagine someone develops a very, very sophisticated pill that you can take that will give you all these great subjective experiences. Or the philosopher Robert Nozick has a kind of thought experiment of an experience machine, which you can hook yourself up to. You can choose to hook yourself up to. And if you do, it's sort of like a virtual reality machine, and it will simulate exactly all of the positive subjective experiences anyone could ever wish for. You know, you'll be filled with joy, you'll be kind of incredibly satisfied with your life, you'll be so engaged with what you're doing and all of that. Of course, it will all be produced by, you know, the machine, not by real life activities and circumstances. So in the subjective well-being sense, the modern psychological sense of happiness, a life hooked up to a machine like that, once you've hooked yourself up, you'll forget that you've made the decision to hook yourself up, right? It'll just seem to you like you're really having all these great experiences. So in the subjective well-being sense of happiness, that would be a very happy life for someone hooked up to that machine. After all, you're getting all the positive experiences and emotions. But Aristotle thinks it wouldn't be a happy life. It wouldn't be an enviable life for a human being. You shouldn't hook yourself up if you want to live well or live a genuinely happy life, even though it would give you all these fabulous, desirable, conscious experiences. And the reason for that is that those experiences would not, Aristotle thinks, be connected to real life activities and relationships in the right way. So, you know, you imagine you could take a pill that would simulate, you know, the lovely experience of being with your loved ones and having a picnic, you know, in the park, something that I think lots of us appreciate, particularly after not having been able to do it for so long. Aristotle says, you know, your happiness consists in the feelings connected to the activities. But if you just siphon off the feelings, if you just pop a pill that, you know, a very good pill that would actually make you feel all the warmth and all of that and love that goes with those actual sort of relationships, that wouldn't be true. That wouldn't be, you know, genuine happiness. It would be artificial happiness. It would be like rouge on the cheek of someone young rather than the genuine bloom of youth. Right? It would be a sort of faux artificial kind of happiness, the pill-produced happiness or the experience machine happiness. There is a huge debate among scholars about whether the modern current ways of thinking about happiness are just the purely psychological conception, or whether we might have inherited something of the Aristotelian idea of happiness. And the way to see how, you know, which way of thinking about happiness is dominant for you is to consider a case like The Truman Show. So I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Truman Show, which I highly recommend. It's fun. But it's also philosophically interesting because in that show, the main character, Truman, believes that he has the perfect life. You know, He believes that he has a loving family and a successful career and good health and all of the kind of standards, you know, he's meeting all the standards for a successful life. And so he feels satisfied and feels very happy. But unbeknownst to him, it's all an elaborate deception perpetrated by an evil TV network. And in fact, he's a character in a virtual reality show, you know, unbeknownst to him. And it's all an illusion. You know, his so-called family and friends are just paid actors, you know, paid to deceive him. When you think about a case like Truman, I mean, there's no doubt we can all agree that Truman feels happy, right? He certainly feels happy. But would you say that he's leading a happy life? Would you say that he has a happy life? If you wanted, are you able to put your hands up just out of interest, you know, in the hand control down in the reaction section? If you think that Truman is leading a happy life, do you want to put your hand up? Yes. Anyone inclined not to say he's not? He feels happy, sure, but he's living in a fool's paradise. He's not leading a happy life. Okay, so that is interesting. I'm not surprised Jim puts his hand up. So that is Aristotle's conception of happiness, that you're, or something close to it, that you're sympathetic to there. Happiness is not just a psychological state. It can't be, because Truman's got all the right psychological states. So if you don't want to say he's happy, something's missing from his life. Thank you. That's interesting. So actually the vast majority of people are inclined to say that Truman is not happy. Okay. So for Aristotle, happiness is not just being in the subjective state, it's living well, receiving pleasure from the objectively right sources, which are sort of, you know, virtuous activities, as the quote at the beginning illustrated. So you've got to have the right connection between your, the kind of desirable feelings and subjective states and what's happening in the world, you know, the actual circumstances of your life and what you're doing for there to be true happiness. So no purely psychological state is kind of sufficient for happiness, as philosophers would often want to put that. So what are these? So Aristotle says happiness is living well, and that's almost a definitional truth. But the question is, well, what does it take to live well? And so to refer back to the original quote, Aristotle's making two claims. One is that happiness consists in virtuous activity. So we've got this idea of virtuous activity being necessary for happiness. You've got to receive pleasure and good feelings from the right sources. And then the second part of the quote is a view that Aristotle expresses in some parts of the Nicomachean Ethics, that the best kind of happiness, or the best activity for humans, is contemplation, specifically kind of the intellectual activity of contemplation, and doing that well. That's what the good life for human beings consists in. So the good life, this is just to sort of give you an overview of where we're heading in case we run out of time, which we might well, because I'll stop in about 5 minutes. So the good life for human beings consists in pleasure and satisfaction and enjoyment taken in the activity of the specific activity of contemplation. There's another interpretation of Aristotle, which I myself like much better than I would not have chosen the second part of that quote if it was up to me, which emphasizes contemplation. I like another interpretation of Aristotle, where what Aristotle's recommending is kind of a sort of excellence, a rational excellence in living more generally, not just in the specific activity of contemplation, but in morality, in friendship, in politics, political life, you know, the whole of your life. There's a kind of a way of living and a way of being that's excellent, that's much in 20 minutes we can't talk about that, I'm sorry. So Aristotle does have a very famous function argument. He thinks you can, the way he sort of arrives at the idea that the virtuous life for human beings, or the good life for human beings, consists in excellent rational activity, is by sort of thinking, well, look, if you could, you know, there's this general principle, which he calls the function principle, which is that, you know, for anything that has a function, the good for that thing is to perform its function well or excellently. So if you think about a knife, you know, a good knife is one that cuts well. That's the function of a knife. So a good knife is one that performs its function well. A good surgeon, you know, is one who cuts well. You know, a clock has a certain function. Its function is to keep time. So a good clock is one that keeps time well. A heart has a certain sort of function. Its function is to, you know, roughly pump up oxygenated blood around your body. So a good heart is one that performs that function well. So then the question is, do humans have a distinctive function? Is there something that humans are sort of their proper function, something that it's the proper business of a human to do? And if so, what is that function? So Aristotle thought, it has to be said without much argument, that there is a distinctive human function. And what it is the performance of of rational activity. So that's the second step there in the argument. And so he thinks the good for a human being is a lifetime of excellent performance of rational activity. And as I said, the kind of main interpretation of excellent rational activity is the idea that it involves excellence specifically in contemplation. There's a specific rational activity, contemplation, the kind of thing that we're engaged in now when we're thinking about what Aristotle said, and that's the distinctive human function. What's good for us is to contemplate well. I want to just say something about the idea of virtuous activity, because I think it's just interesting. I mean, it's important for Aristotle's idea of happiness, but it's sort of interesting in its own right to think about how Aristotle thinks about virtues as being the mean between two vices. So this is called the doctrine of the mean. So think about, so what's courage? How do we determine what the virtue of courage is? So virtues are kind of good character traits for Aristotle, not necessarily just moral character traits. You know, they might be non-moral as well, just desirable character traits. So courage, you can think of courage, Aristotle thinks, as the mean between two vices. One is an excess, you know, recklessness, and the other is a kind of vice of deficiency, cowardice. Temperance, right, is the mean. So if you think of these things as being on a continuum, temperance is in the middle, temperance is the virtue, and it's in the middle between kind of at one end the stinginess and at the other end profligacy. So Aristotle thinks that, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, I think there's a very practical interpretation of Aristotle as a sort of self-educate on happiness, as a sort of self-education project. You have to try and turn yourself into a certain, if you want to live well by Aristotle standards, you have to try and turn yourself into a certain sort of person, the sort of person who takes pleasure in virtuous activities. And so what you should try and do is make yourself, you know, well, courageous, temperate. You should, or if you have a narrow idea about what Aristotle's recommending is specifically contemplation, you should try and make yourself an excellent contemplator and take pleasure. So Aristotle thinks these things have a self-reinforcing cycle. If if you take a step towards contemplating, you turn up to the event tonight, you start thinking about Aristotle's view, that's one step in the right direction into turning yourself into the sort of person who will begin to take pleasure in this kind of virtuous activity. And once you start taking pleasure in it, you'll want to do more of it. And so you'll get better at it, and so on. And so there's a kind of reinforcing cycle. So the genuinely happy eudaimon individual is not someone who's chipper and upbeat and has all these subjective well-being states, but someone who has those states in response to the right sorts of activities and relationships. They have to take pleasure in virtuous activity. Okay, last slide. Aristotle's view has some very famous, there are some very famous objections to it. One is, especially on the narrow view, where we're thinking about there just being one kind of good life for all human beings, the life of contemplation, intellectual contemplation. Aristotle's view entails that human beings who aren't capable, either through their nature or through circumstances, of engaging in that sort of contemplation, they can't be happy. So Aristotle was, and that seems to many people sort of inhumane or just mistaken. So Aristotle was quite upfront. He saw that that was an implication of his view. He noted that, it followed that slaves couldn't be eudaimon through circumstances. They had to work all the time. They didn't have the leisure that's required to develop excellent rational activity. So they were condemned to, it was a tragedy, Aristotle thought, that they were condemned, they were denied eudaimonia. But also, I suppose, in our times as well, human beings with severe mental impairments or severe cognitive impairments can't be happy in this eudaimon sense. And that also strikes some people as wrong and unacceptable. Okay, but so so there are contemporary Aristotelians who like Aristotle's idea, the general idea that genuine happiness involves some connection between desirable subjective states and desirable activities. But they don't like Aristotle's particular narrow substantive account of what the activities have to be that constitute the good life. If you're interpreting Aristotle narrowly as saying there's just one type of good life for all human beings, and that's the life of contemplation. And I think actually that one way of persuading people that maybe, we should take much more seriously Aristotle's idea of happiness than many people do nowadays is to think of, just think of examples like Aldous Huxley's dystopic novel, Brave New World, where I'm not going to read out all this quote, but, the citizens in Brave New World are as happy as you could be in any purely subjective psychological sense of the word. They're, as the controller says to John the Savage, the world's stable now, people are happy, they get what they want and they never want what they can't get. And if anything should go wrong, there's Soma. But as the Savage character reminds us, well, aren't there things that we value besides? Aren't there important ingredients missing from Brave New World that make us think that this is not a good life for human beings? And one of the really important aspects of Aristotle's conception of happiness is to remind us that there might be more to life than happiness in the purely psychological sense. I'll finish there.
Caroline, thank you very much. That was excellent. We'll come back to you later with questions. Those of you who would be following the brochure that advertised our function would expect Dr. Anthony Hooper to come on now to talk about the Socrates quote, "The only thing I claim to know is the art of love." Unfortunately, Anthony's 100-year-old grandmother died on the weekend, and today is the day they're holding her funeral and then hosting a wake this evening. So he has not been able to join us. Hence, Caroline and Tim have agreed to talk a little bit longer. So they're giving us probably 30 minutes of their wisdom rather than 20 minutes. So thank you, Caroline. Now let me introduce Tim Smart. Tim is a research associate and lecturer in philosophy at the Institute of Ethics and Society at the University of Notre Dame here in Sydney. His chosen topic is from Aristotle, and he says, "He who is unable to live in society or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself must either be a beast or a god." So Tim, over to you, and then afterwards we'll take some questions for both Caroline and Tim for our remaining time. Thanks, Tim.
All right, thanks very much. Thank you, Susan, for organising this and for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming. I think it's just wonderful, the philosophical community that exists around the North Sydney Library. It's really wonderful to see this going on in the community. I'm going to be talking about society and community today. So I think Aristotle would be very happy to know that philosophical activity is going on in a community like this. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking to you today about what Aristotle had to say pretty much about society. So here's the quote, and I'll unpack a couple of things from this. So Aristotle said, "He who is unable to live in society or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself must either be a beast or a god." He who is unable to live in a society or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself must either be a beast or a god. Okay, so what does that mean? So pretty much the basic idea is that Aristotle thought we needed each other. We deeply needed each other. So I'm gonna, my remarks are gonna try to cover some of the ideas that Aristotle had about kind of what that need consists in, how society fills that need, and then to try to switch gears a little bit and imagine if Aristotle was plonked down in 2021 Sydney, what he might think about the health or the state of our society and how well we're doing to serve some of those needs. Yeah. So the basic idea is that we really need each other, and Aristotle took this very seriously. So he thought living in community with one another and having all the kinds of social bonds that we do with other people isn't just something you might do if you wanted to do it, or is, you know, if you were an extrovert, you might do that, or if you're an introvert, you might not be so into that. But he thought that it was just absolutely fundamental and necessary to being a human being. So this quote comes from his book on political philosophy. And just before this quote, he has another remark, which is one of his other famous quotes about society, where he says that humanity is by nature a political animal, and much more so than all the other creatures. Humanity is by nature a political animal. And what he means there is that we have a natural appetite to live together. We have a natural appetite to connect with other people, to cooperate with other people, to engage in enterprises where we build things, solve problems, help one another out, serve one another, supply one another's needs, involved in each other's lives in all sorts of ways, all the kinds of social bonds that make up society. Aristotle thought we have a natural appetite for those things, just like we might have a whole bunch of other natural appetites for sleep and food and drink and things like that. And then, so society then serves this need. This is how we satisfy this very natural appetite. And what's interesting is that at this point you might think, well, if we have this natural appetite, there are lots of different ways you can get relationships. there are lots of different ways that connecting with one another might satisfy your natural appetites for society, for connection, for human connection. But Aristotle thought that it was mainly society which satisfied this appetite. And so he took it that our civic relationships, so our relationships with sort of everyone else that we have in society, so all the strangers that you're walking past every day, although you're probably not doing that so much these days, but all the next door neighbors you live next to, the people who live in your building who maybe you don't know, the people who live on the other side of Sydney and Australia. He thought that those relationships, those civic relationships with other people in society, those were like the fundamental way that you satisfy your craving for connection with other people. He talked about human beings as being individuals as a part of a whole. The whole is society, and you're just necessarily connected to that whole. You're necessarily just like a little dot within a whole. All the other relationships or associations that you might take up, Aristotle thought were in a sense optional, or were in a sense less fundamental than belonging to a society. So, you know, friends might come and go, associations that you might be a part of, even deeply meaningful ones like close, like religious or moral associations or familial connections or things like that. He thought in some sense those were less fundamental and less important than our connection with other people that we just belong in a society to. So he took this idea very seriously that, yeah, we're necessarily a part of a whole, and we have this natural connection, natural appetite to connect with other people. And this is how we do it. So yeah, I want to talk very quickly about what this might mean for us, why Aristotle thought maybe you should believe this, and then consider some applications from it for us. So before we get there though, I wanted to actually come back to something that Caroline mentioned as well, which is the experience machine. Because I think Aristotle, thinking about the experience machine, the thought experiment with this perspective from Aristotle, gives a very interesting answer, I think. So the experience machine thought experiment, originally proposed by the philosopher Robert Nozick, goes like this. It says, as Caroline just outlined, it says, well, imagine you could hook yourself up to a machine. So imagine you are sort of in a position like this character, where there's some very advanced virtual reality, and you could go into that machine forever, for the rest of your life. And then what would happen is that your consciousness would just be filled with all the best experiences that you could possibly have. And before you go into the experience machine, you do an incredibly thorough psychological evaluation where they figure out exactly what it is that would bring you joy and pleasure. And so the experiences are not meant to be trivial, or they're not meant to wear off, or they're not meant to be kind of experiences that you could take it or leave it. But when you get into the experience machine, the rest of your life is that you're meant to experience just all the very best stuff that you could possibly imagine. And so then the idea is, well, but of course, to get into the machine, you'd go to sleep forever and just be a receptacle for these experiences going on in your consciousness. So in a sense, you need to leave your real life and trade it for this machine. And so the thought experiment is just, well, would you do it? Would you get in? Would you trade your real life for a life of maximal pleasure, all the best kind of experiences you could imagine, just that they're not actually connected with your real life? So I just wanted to, I was curious about taking a raise of hands as well. Who would get into this machine, do you think? If some amazing scientist came along right now and said, we've tested this, it's safe, it's going to fulfill all your wildest dreams, who might get into this?
Tim, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
So for me, I think the thing about the experience machine is you're in it and everyone else is in it on their own. It's not like the Matrix, is it? Because
that's right.
Because I might be happy to go into the Matrix, but not this.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, it's just you, and the only kind of connections you're going to be having is with chemical reactions in your brain. You're not going to be bumping into other people, even simulations of other people. I think I see no hands. Is that right? No one's getting in the machine. All right, good. I think most philosophers would say, well, that's the correct answer. And it's kind of, then the interesting thing is figuring out, well, why that's the correct answer. Yeah, Elon Musk might jump in. So there was the reason I say that is there was a recent poll done of philosophers, a recent survey of professional philosophers where they said, what's your view about a whole bunch of questions? And one of the questions was, would you get into the machine, the experience machine? And 77% of professional philosophers said they would definitely not get into the experience machine. And in the world of philosophy, that's about as close as you ever come to consensus. Those are amazing results. There are still some people who said they would get in. So there is some interesting things to be thought about for the case for getting in. But by and large, the majority of people, when they meet this, said they would not get in. Okay, so why not? So there are a few different answers for why you wouldn't get into the experience machine. And the main kind of one is that, well, when you think about like, what would it take for my life to go well? What do I want from my life? It turns out that we value some things more than pleasure, or that we think that a good life consists in more than just having subjective, as Caroline mentioned, subjective well-being. And then a very interesting question is, okay, cool. So what else does a good life consist in? And here's where there is, I think the experience machine can highlight Aristotle's very interesting answer. And Aristotle would say, one reason you absolutely shouldn't get into the experience machine is because for your life to go well, you need relationships with real people. So if you get into that experience machine, you're going to be fundamentally cut off from society. And Aristotle thought that that was absolutely not the way to have a good life. So if you had the kind of reaction to this thought experiment, like, I wouldn't get into that because it seems like there is something unnatural about trading my real life for that kind of life. If you thought that it's, there even seemed to be something a little bit sad about getting in, trading your real life for that kind of life. One of the reasons that you might have had that kind of reaction would be this kind of Aristotelian idea. You're giving up real relationships to, trading those for pleasurable experiences. Or when you're getting into the experience machine, no amount of subjective well-being can make up for the fact that you are losing other people, essentially. Okay, so Aristotle thought that this having other people in your life, being connected with other people in society was incredibly important. So it's worth just looking at a little bit more about why he thought this. And I guess in general, he thought this for sort of like empirical, practical reasons, and then he thought it for more philosophical, or what you might think of as moral reasons. So I'll just go over these very quickly. The two reasons are that you need other people to survive, and you need other people, as Caroline mentioned, to be happy. You need other people to lead a good life. So let me give you a very quick fly over the territory of how Aristotle thought about this. So there is a very sort of, there's an interesting just empirical fact that human beings need other human beings.
Tim, can I interrupt for a minute? Kevin, would you mind keeping your comments till the end? I'm finding them very distracting. Sorry, Tim, keep going.
No worries. So the empirical aspect to what Aristotle was saying was just that quite literally we need other people to survive, and we need other people to survive in all sorts of ways. If you imagine a person who is, say, like a Robinson Crusoe figure, someone who lives completely outside of society, they have no interactions with other people, they can't depend on other people for anything, they don't cooperate with people for anything, they just completely live life by their own steam. Aristotle thinks that person wouldn't survive. That person wouldn't survive very long. And I think the experience of childhood even emphasizes this even more. Children, when they're born as very new humans, are completely helpless, and without the care of other people in society, a newborn human wouldn't last or wouldn't survive for more than a few hours. Whereas that's not the case with other animals. Some animals, as soon as they're born, they're ready to walk and to fend for themselves very quickly. So the empirical point is that Aristotle thought we just do need other people to survive, to meet our basic need. But then there is also a more philosophical point, and I think that this is the very interesting one to reflect on and to try to think about the various aspects of this. And it's the point is that Aristotle thought we need other people, we need connections to society to lead a good life. So Aristotle thought that society does more than just pool all of our resources so that every different member of society can access more resources than they would be able to get by themselves. That's certainly true. That helps for survival. I don't have a banana tree in my backyard, but I can go to a shop and buy some bananas because other people have banana trees, so on. But Aristotle thought that is not all that society does for people. So in his writings, he's always coming back to a question. And the question is, what is the purpose of a particular thing? So Aristotle is always asking whatever sort of interests him. At some point, he'll always sort of ask, well, what is the function of this particular thing? Like, what is this thing built to do? Or what is this thing meant to do? If this thing was operating properly, what would it achieve? And so he asks this question of society. So he says, well, what is the purpose of society? What is society for? If society was going really well, what would it achieve? And his answer is that in one sense, society comes into existence for the sake of life. That's for the sake of mere survival. But also, his answer goes beyond this. He thinks society exists to promote the good life. He thinks society exists to promote happiness, as he originally wrote that eudaimonia idea of happiness. So that is something I think Aristotle would want us all to remember, because that is where the quote that we began with sort of eventually ends up in Aristotle's thinking about political philosophy. He would want us to remember that the aim of society is to allow everyone who lives in society to live a good life. So in the best societies, that's what's happening. And in societies which are falling short, which are not healthy or not just or something like that, then this is not happening. Perhaps only a few people are able to live a good life, or perhaps there's something going on in the society which means that no one in it is going to be able to live a good life. Okay, so that's where his thinking on society gets us. And then, of course, the question then becomes this really interesting ethical question. Well, what is the good life? What does the good life consist in? And that's where some of what Caroline was talking about, and where lots of big work in moral philosophy has really picked up this question and ran with it, because it's then becomes very important to figure out, well, if society exists to foster the good life so that people who are connected with one another can achieve that, then what is that? And for Aristotle, some of the answers were virtuous activity, so allowing people to be good, so belonging to a society helps cultivate people's moral development. He thought it was allowed people to exercise their rational activities. Belonging to a society allows you to engage in some of the rational excellences that Caroline was talking about, and some of those, and a number of other things. Okay, so that's the general picture. What I thought I would do just to wrap up is try to end things on a more contemporary note. I stumbled upon this picture maybe a year ago or something. This is someone's attempt to show us what Aristotle would look like today based on his bust. So and this is just to prompt your imagination. So just think about imagine Aristotle was alive today, walking around Sydney, meeting all of us, talking to us about how our lives are going and what society is like. What do you think his advice would be for us today about how society is going? So I thought that there were, I would love to hear your thoughts about this in the Q&A when we get to it, but a couple of things occurred to me. I thought one is that I think Aristotle would be very concerned that a lot of things are going on in society where it seems like we're trying too much to live without each other. It feels like we're trying to get away as much as we can from depending upon one another, or from interacting with strangers, or from having really meaningful kind of civic bonds with one another just because we're members of the same society. So Aristotle thought that that was very important, just cooperating with other people because you belong to the same society. And it seems like a lot of things are going on that are moving us away from that, or are taking away some of the difficulties of that, or the inconveniences of that, or the challenges of that. So this is a picture of Mark Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook, unveiling his vision for the next phase of the internet. And the next phase of the internet, one way to think about this is that you're going to be interacting with real people a lot less directly. You're going to be interacting with real people through virtual reality, much more sophisticated virtual reality. And his vision for this is that you can enter a virtual reality world where everyone is interacting through that. And it seems like that is getting away from some of the social bonds and social connections that Aristotle thought were incredibly healthy and meaningful for society. So he might be worried that we're trying to live without each other too much. One thing too is I think he would be very interested in the recent lockdown that we've all been through, because this has been, it's been incredibly challenging and controversial and everything else, but it's also been, in some sense, a morally educational experience for a lot of people, because it's helped them think about or it's given them an experience of isolation, or an experience of fragility, which was no doubt not wanted, but also perhaps which they haven't experienced for a long time, or perhaps even to that degree before. And so one very interesting question to ask in the wake of lockdown is, in what ways was it surprisingly hard to be disconnected from other people? So lockdown was a condition in which so many of our social interactions, which we take for granted, particularly social interactions with people who aren't really your nearest and dearest. So people that you walk past on the street, or people you might regularly see at the coffee shop, or people who you might interact with in society in a much more sort of formal way, like just in terms of interacting with them for their services, or because they're a colleague or something like that. So lockdown made a whole lot of these regular social interactions evaporate. And so Aristotle would be very interested in asking the question, well, did you miss those? Or what's one thing that you can try to remember from how your life changed by not having a lot of those social interactions in it? And I think that would be a very meaningful kind of question to reflect on, and to think about how why some of the social interactions, our social bonds, are very important to us, perhaps in surprising ways. The last thing that I think Aristotle would be interested in is just the way in which we're living in very fractious times, where it seems to be that people disagree with each other in very strong ways. And there's a lot of, from all sorts of places, a lot of sort of emphasis to get away from relying on one another so much, or lowering trust in one another so much that it seems to not just make our social connections with one another difficult, but to really to break them, essentially. So societies can be healthy, or toxic societies can be damaged or repaired, and they can even be destroyed. And so I think Aristotle would be very interested in looking at a whole lot of the social bonds that we have with one another, and thinking about the ways in which they might be deteriorating over the long term. So what I was thinking about here is that one of my research projects at the moment is looking at the topic of conspiracy theories. So this is a very famous conspiracy theorist, one of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th in DC earlier this year. And one of the interesting things I've learned is that groups like Facebook and YouTube actively radicalize people. So what this means is that, just say you're watching a video on YouTube and it has some political kind of take, YouTube will recommend that you watch something which then has a kind of even more extreme political take. And then when you watch that, it will recommend that you watch something which again is sort of like another notch along the political spectrum. And Facebook does the same thing in terms of encouraging you to join groups. And one thing I've learned is that people who have sort of like moved in and out of believing in conspiracy theories, or who have moved in and out of groups where there seems to be something fundamentally antisocial about the group or uncooperative about the group, is that they've said that they've found that they ended up in these groups just by spending too much time on the internet, just by watching too many things on YouTube or Facebook. And so I think Aristotle would be very interested in and very worried about the ways in which not only sort of like our natural disagreements with one another can put pressure on our social connections, but also very interested in the way in which society might be set up in such a way, or becoming more and more set up in such a way, that it's very easy to polarize, or it's very easy to break civic friendship, civic connection with one another. Okay, so I can wrap it up there, so we have enough time to get into some Q&A. So
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks very much.
That was really terrific, much appreciated. Now, both Caroline and Tim have agreed that they'll take questions. Can I please invite you to do so, but can I also remind you to keep your questions brief, so that everyone has the opportunity to be involved and not just one or two. Who wants to go first?
Also, there were some questions in the chat. Like
all right, do you want to go to the chat room?
Tim, there was one for you about your experience machine. Is that a type of heaven?
Now, Kevin, could you keep it brief, please?
Hi, I'm not sure what I wrote in the chat. It was more or less being interactive at the time, but I have a question for Caroline in a sense. Caroline, I was wondering about this inverse relationship between material wealth and the good life. Like, there is this notion which we're sold in society about prosperity means the acquisition of greater material wealth, but often they say that by getting that, you become imprisoned by it. I was wondering whether you might like to comment upon material wealth and the good life. It's like the true man idea, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. That's a great question. So if we're just thinking about the subjective aspects of the good life, and I assume that most of us here are in broad agreement that, other things being equal, it's better not to be stressed out, not to be anxious all the time, to sort of feel secure, then to be engaged with what we're doing, so we kind of value the positive emotions and kind of, other things being equal, would rather have more of those than the so-called negative emotions. So if you're just looking at that sort of emotional well-being, there's a lot of evidence that suggests sort of up to a certain threshold, about US $75,000 or equivalent, which I suppose is about every extra dollar you earn makes an enormous difference to people's emotional well-being. So you sort of removing financial stress is very important. But once you get over that kind of threshold where your basic needs are met and you don't have to worry about whether you can pay the mortgage and the electricity bill and things, then over that, it's very striking that every extra dollar you earn makes next to no difference to how you feel moment to moment as you go about your life. And that's true at the same time as society as a whole has become much more materialistic and attaches much more value to wealth. So studies, I mean, I find quite worrying looking at studies of college students in the US and also Australian students who, if you go back 40 years and you ask students whether it was more important to them to earn money or to have a meaningful philosophy of life, Back 40 years ago, the overwhelming majority of people said it was more important to have a meaningful philosophy of life. But now it's flipped. Now everyone thinks, you know, well, not everyone, but around 80% think that it's more important to earn a good income than, you know, earn lots of money than it is to. So I think that on any measure of the good life, whether we're thinking about emotional well-being or you know, the quality of our relationships and things like that, having enough money is important, but having any more makes very little difference. And the other thing is that unless you spend, people don't, when people do have money, they don't spend it wisely. You know, they buy stuff. They don't, all the psychologists' happiness studies say that if you get wealthy, it's best if it's by accident, if you don't value money, because the more you value money, paradoxically, the less happiness getting it brings you. Yeah. And then I suppose the other thing is that you shouldn't, if you are lucky enough to have money to spare, don't spend it on objects, spend it on experiences. So, you know, buy yourself out of, you know, don't buy cars, buy time with friends and family, or doing hobbies and projects that really engage you, that you want to do even if you weren't, you know, paid. So
thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Kevin. Margaret, next question. Margaret, are you letting people
Yes, there was one from Samantha to Tim asking, is the experience machine another name for heaven?
Yeah, that's a little outside that's a very interesting question, a little outside my wheelhouse, because I guess it depends what you mean by heaven. And I think different religious traditions have different answers to that. But I think like that's definitely, it's along the right lines, but where it might be different is that if you think heaven's real or heaven's a real place, or that you're going to have actual you're going to survive your bodily death in some sense and then keep living your life somewhere else, and it's going to be really good, then that's not what the experience machine is talking about, because in the experience machine, the only thing that's real is your sensations, and there's nothing else about the way you're living your life which is connected with reality. Whereas I think some views about, so it depends what you mean about heaven. You could describe heaven as like an actual society where you're bumping into other people and pursuing projects together and things like that. So
in heaven would be not real either, because if I die and go to heaven and I see my mother would probably not want to see herself as an 80-year-old, but as a 20-year-old woman. So I must be seeing a virtual version of my mother, which would be like the experience machine. So I see everybody the way I want to see them in my heaven, in the experience machine, and my mother would see herself the way she is at her peak and not have me hanging around. So that's
right, yeah. That's
for her as well.
Yeah, I think we need a theologian or a scholar of religion to help with this. But yeah, it's interesting what you described, because you described a situation where I guess there's real interaction, but you're sort of thinking your representations of reality are different. You're relating to one another, but you're seeing yourselves at different times in your life or something.
But
like
that doesn't work if I relate to my mother as my mother, as she relates to me, another 30-year-old woman or 20. Weird. But
yeah, I see.
Yeah, and other question with the experience is, have you, I don't think anyone would have done this, but place the same question whether or not you go into a machine to a group of people who are suicidal, because we all have happy lives more or less, so we don't want to exchange it for this virtual life. But if people are really suicidal and want to seek an alternative, they may choose to go into the machine. And I think they would. I think if my life was really bad, I lived in a dystopia, I probably would choose to go into a machine. But because my life isn't like that, I would say no.
Can I jump in on that? I mean, there's a scene in The Matrix where one of the characters, has a choice between, a horrible real life of suffering and this kind of taste of steak. Who's the character? What's his name? Cypher. And he chooses the experience machine or the matrix.
Stay in a machine.
Thank you, Samantha. Margaret, who's next?
I can see Laura had a question, but you're on mute, Laura.
You're
okay,
on mute.
I'm mute now. I listened to a program on Life Matters, which is the increasing cost of happiness, which you, Caroline, have been referring to, the $75,000 level, that after that there's a diminishing marginal returns on it. But what they also determined was, which I thought was quite interesting, it's based on the Canadian study by Morris, is that in early childhood, there's a common health status where everybody's sort of more or less happy. But as they go into adolescence, that just decreases in time. And I'd be interested in just seeing from a perspective of aging, what Tim and you say about happiness. I know that what constitutes happiness perhaps could change with age, but well, generally the impact, and also then towards the end of our discussion just then, euthanasia. When you are no longer happy, do you euthanize? Would you like to comment?
Well, I think euthanasia raises a whole lot of other things. Very interesting issue. I'm happy to talk about it. But just in general with the happiness studies, the results that you get vary a lot depending on what kind of happiness you're measuring, whether you're looking at life satisfaction or whether you're looking at emotional well-being, how people feel. So life satisfaction is people's intellectual assessments of whether their life is successful, you know, by their own lights.
Yeah.
Versus how you feel moment to moment. Are you experiencing more positive emotions? So with aging, most of the studies that I know of suggest that life has a kind of the shape of a smile. People start off quite happy. They get less happy through adolescence. That you bottom out in your 40s, mid-40s, and then it's uphill from there.
Yes, it improves.
Yeah, it improves. Yeah. So the shape of a smile is the data looking at, on euthanasia. I think that's very, you know, if you're terminally ill and life is full of suffering and there's no prospect of relief, well, I couldn't, you know, it doesn't seem, you know, I can see why people might prefer, you know, might prefer not to live a life of suffering when that's all that life has in store.
And Tim, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think it raises a very interesting question about sort of like life planning, because sometimes the decisions you make at a particular point in your life really lock you in, or like they really have big consequences for how the rest of your life goes, essentially. And then you change as you get older, and different things make you happy. So there's this very interesting thought experiment from a philosopher called Derek Parfit. I think it's called The Rich Young Nobleman. And it's the story kind of goes, there's this noble aristocrat, he's 20 years old or something, and he's very rich. And he thinks, what I want to do right now with all my riches is donate it to the revolutionaries, because I sympathize with overturning the aristocracy or the king or something like that. And I want the revolutionaries to win. But then he thinks about it. He thinks, well, but, you know, I know that when I get older, I'll probably be much more conservative than I am right now. And I'll, you know, not sympathize with them anymore. And I'll regret that I did that. And so he's making this decision, thinking about sort of two moments in his life. And at the moment, he knows what he wants to do with all his wealth. But then he's thinking that maybe 20, 30, 40 years down the track, that's not going to make me happy. That's going to make that person miserable. So he's trying to think about, how do I plan out my life so that not just me right now is happy, but this whole continuous person through time is happy. And then that gets, I think that's a topic, kind of the ethics of life planning, essentially, or the thinking about happiness over time, which I think is a very interesting and a very tricky question. And you hit like smaller versions of this problem when you're like, oh, should I, you know, put more money in my super or whatever, or should I spend it on a holiday? Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. Great question. Margaret, who's next?
Me. Have you seen the Bruce Willis movie where he and his wife and everyone has a sort of virtual person that they send out into the world while they stay in their room? No,
I haven't heard of that one.
It's just like a sort of plastic body, and it goes out and it looks perfect. It doesn't look like them. It's the best version of themselves. And so just wondering, what would Aristotle think about our fascination with the Matrix and this movie about, you know, living outside our bodies?
I think that's one for Tim.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think he would be, you know, his mind would be blown, of course, about the technology for one. But what mattered to him was the reality of the social interactions. And then what we're describing is where the social interactions are real, but in some sense, I don't know, they're less immediate. So they're mediated through something unusual. So in the Bruce Willis example that you mentioned, and this is also, I imagine, the case for, or this will be the case with augmented reality, the metaverse that Zuckerberg is describing, which is where instead of relating to people, I guess the main one is like face to face, or another one might be like this, where we're not, you know, in the same room together, but we're still looking at each other's face. You relate to one another through some kind of a simulation or some other kind of representation of who they are. How that, I mean, I really feel like that damages that my intuition is that damages social interaction, or that like you lose a whole lot of what's going on when you're actually having a conversation with a person, when you're having a conversation through some kind of a digital representation of them, especially if they look sort of different or strange or something like that. That's my gut feel about that. But then I think that is just an interesting topic that you could think about in a lot of different ways. Are those augmented social interactions, you know, essentially worse or diminished social interactions? And if so, why?
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? That we've run out of questions in the chat.
I can see Chris has got his hand up.
Yes, I do. And I want to thank Caroline and Tim for those excellent presentations. I have a few questions. I know we're running out of time, so maybe you can choose whatever one you want to answer. For Caroline, the distinction that you made with your preferred interpretation of the quotation is that you said that Aristotle, it sounded like theoria or contemplation was the highest form of human activity. And that's the common interpretation of the quotation. And your preferred interpretation was that more sophrosini or practical wisdom was more important. So I wanted to know if you thought that there was to be some kind of moderation in contemplation and practical wisdom. And my question for Tim had to do with Nietzsche's quotation about the third type that Aristotle missed, the philosopher who is both beast and God, and what your interpretation of that quotation is. And then my final one was for both Caroline and Tim, since you both work in ethics, and Tim, you mentioned the Phil Papers survey. And I wanted to know your meta-ethical views, whether you're moral realist or anti-realist. I know the Phil Papers, it was around 60% were moral realists. So I know we're running out of time, so whatever questions you want to answer there, thank you.
Yes, Tim, we are running, Chris, we are running out of time, so we can't possibly deal with all of those and share time with other people. Caroline, do you want to pick one for a couple of minutes? And Tim, do you want to pick one for a couple of minutes as well?
I'll be very quick.
We share the time left.
Chris, the first question is absolutely is fantastic. I don't really, I've talked about the question of how the two kind of interpretations of Aristotle, where you sort of think that the kind of contemplation reading where there's a specific activity, the excellent exercise of which makes a good life, versus the excellence in living, you know, more generally. And I don't know, Rick has presented me with lots of textual support. So actually, I think the person you should ask about that, you should email my colleague, Rick Benitez. He's fantastic. I am in print defending a kind of moral anti-realism, a sort of moral fictionalist view that is very different to Aristotle's.
Thank you, Caroline. Tim?
I'm sorry, Chris, you've stumped me on both fronts, so I'm not sure what to say about both. I find meta-ethics very confusing in the sense when I criticize people, I tend to mean it. If I'm like, you shouldn't do that, I really mean they shouldn't have done that, then or if I say this is great, I mean it's great. But then all the philosophical questions about semantics and metaphysics beyond that are very, you know, tricky and interesting. And so I'm committed on those sort of things. And then your question is a great one too, about, well, how do you make sense of the like, there are all these categories in Aristotle about like ways of living, essentially. And you've got the life of contemplation at one end and the bestial life at the other end. And then the example you mentioned of blending the two, and what do you say about that? From an Aristotelian framework. Again, I'm not sure what to say about that. Sorry. Good question, though.
Okay, Margaret, are there any other questions in the chat room?
Yes, Kevin has a question, and I can see Jane also has a question.
Now we'll take Jane. Kevin's already had his turn, and we're going to run out of time.
Oh,
so
sorry.
let's go to Jane.
Sorry, Kevin. I just wondered, first of all, thank you to both of you for your excellent dissertation. It was great. I wondered whether it's possible that Aristotle is still a man for 2021, and whether we should be promoting some more contemporary philosophers to assist us through the next centuries. And so I know two quick questions. And I wondered if there was anything particularly astute in what Aristotle said when he said people needed others, because it seems to me that societies had lived for thousands of years in smallish groups, very effectively understanding they needed each other.
And Jane, is that question for Caroline or Tim or both?
Oh, anyone who cares to answer. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the first question, because I couldn't agree with you more, Jane, about I think all of the quotes this year that I saw that were put forward as, you know, things to get us started for World Philosophy Day, they were all kind of old white men. Yeah, and yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting, so I think nevertheless there are interesting and important ideas there, but there are also interesting and important and different ideas being discussed by women writing now, contemporary women philosophers and philosophers in China. And yes, so if I were in charge of setting quotes for World Philosophy Day, they would be more diverse, that's for sure.
Thank you.
And Tim?
Yeah, I think it's a very, I can respond to your other question about, so Aristotle said, we need each other. Was that really a sort of genius level insight, or is that something that might have been? And even in the ways that I unpacked, and the way he talks about it in the politics, like we need each other in all these very interesting and sophisticated ways, like was that a genius level insight? The thing, when you mentioned that to me, the thing I thought about is that Aristotle, sort of by historical accident to some extent, enjoys this amazing place in the canon, where absolutely every major philosopher who's come after him, and then also just all sorts of other kinds of intellectual activity in the Islamic and the Latin traditions and the Western tradition more generally, has engaged with Aristotle. And so for some reason, he's just like this, like sort of beginning point for so many intellectual activities. But a lot of his works were lost in the fire of Alexandria, not all of them, but a lot were lost. And so it's a very interesting exercise to play the what if game and to think, well, what if all of them were lost and there was no Aristotle? Would all of these insights have been gone? So we wouldn't have known that it was good to rely on other people. We wouldn't have known that happiness was eudaimonia or whatever. Or would those have been things which other parts of the culture, you know, would have assembled, or there would have been other people would have figured out in other traditions? I mean, that's a kind of speculative question. One other thing that kind of bears worth emphasizing is that Aristotle also took it in his ethics that a lot of what he was doing was systematizing things which everyone else believed. So he took it that he wasn't, these days a philosopher might argue for a controversial view. So say, this is my view, you might not agree with it, I'm going to try to convince you of it. Aristotle largely took himself to be taking views which he thought most people in Athens would agree with and systematizing them or working them out. So a lot of people emphasize that when you read Aristotle, it's not so much that he's trying to convince you of a particular thesis, particularly the kind of things about what a good life consists in, like the ethical kind of elements of his philosophy. But he thought that he was very much capturing what a lot of people in Athens, at least, believe.
I know we're almost out of time.
Caroline, in the last 2 minutes that we've got left, we've got 5 minutes. You can have 2, Tim can have 2. Do you have some closing comments that you'd like to make to the group?
Not really, but thank you for the opportunity to speak. And I did want to jump in actually strangely in defense of Aristotle, because although in reply to kind of Jane, is there genius here and why are we talking about Aristotle? Because even though I do think it would be good to hear a more diverse range of ideas and voices, I do think that there are some really very profound insights in Aristotle. So for instance, the chapters on friendship are extraordinary. I was just, reading them really for my own interest, not directly related to anything I'm working on. But Aristotle had this fascinating idea, he distinguished different types of friendship. And the kind of highest form of friendship was the kind of friendship where we help each other to become better people. So your friend functions as a sort of second self, sort of helping you to be good. And he contrasted that with, ways of thinking about friendship where it's just kind of mutually advantageous. So, you've got something I need and I've got something you want. And so we just, those kind of exchange-based friendships or pleasure-based friendships where we just enjoy each other's company. Aristotle thought, well, that's those sorts of friendships are all kind of well and good, but there's this exceptionally valuable sort of friendship where we see what each other's trying to achieve and we scaffold them in achieving that. And his discussion of that, and just in general, the kind of ways of being that are desirable, I think is incredibly rich. I mean, the Nicomachean Ethics is just an absolutely brilliant read. I can't recommend it highly enough. And I think there's lots of insights in there that, in the modern world, we would be enriched by reminding ourselves of.
Tim, do you have any last closing comments?
I really want to just add my exclamation point to everything Caroline said, especially about the Nicomachean Ethics and Aristotle's ethical works. It's amazing reading them, how familiar they sound, or how relevant they sound, which is amazing to think about just how different the world, ancient Greece that Aristotle was writing in over 2000 years ago. And he's describing these very concrete things about how you should live your life or what's important or how you think about what's of value, things that we all necessarily are doing all the time. And so it's amazing how this thing from another time and place is very relevant. And it's also, if you've never read parts of the Nicomachean Ethics, I think it's also one of the more accessible books in the history of Western philosophy. Some of the books, it feels like you really need to read along with the study guide or to take a course in it to understand just what on earth the sentences mean or something like that. But the Nicomachean Ethics, the main ethics book by Aristotle, I think is a lot easier to sort of read and to have a conversation with as you read it. The other thing I just wanted to say is just to thank you so much for having me. I think it's wonderful that you are doing the philosophy together. Aristotle would absolutely approve. And the thing that I love about philosophy is that it is such a communal activity. So it's an activity that you do through having conversations with one another and along with the text as well. And a lot of the philosophy kind of goes on when you're talking to one another. So yeah, it's wonderful to see you all doing this.
Thank you very much, Tim. And can I thank everyone who came along this evening to make our World Philosophy Day another occasion, which, as I said earlier at the start, we've celebrated now for the 6th year. So that's really terrific. And thank you very much, Caroline and Tim, for giving us your time once again to provide us with some terrific insights into the topics chosen by UNESCO for World Philosophy Day. So thank you very much. And good evening.
Thank you very much from the Stanton Library. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Tim. And thank you, Susan, for organising it.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.